Okay, y'all. Sit down, lock in, because what Rick Ross just did to 50 Cent on a random Tuesday afternoon in Fayetteville, Georgia is not a rap beef anymore. It is a public execution. A financial autopsy. A live, unedited demolition of the G-Unit empire, and by the end of this breakdown, you are going to look at 50 Cent differently for the rest of your life. Because Rick Ross did not clap back with a meme. Rick Ross did not send a diss record. Rick Ross walked outside on his 300-acre estate, sat down by a pool the size of a small lake, pulled out a stack of unredacted corporate documents, and quietly, surgically dismantled the myth that Curtis Jackson has been selling for 15 straight years. And, y'all, stay all the way to the end, because what Rick Ross exposed inside those folders does not just embarrass 50 Cent. It exposes that the man mocking everybody else's money for a decade might actually be the most leveraged, most contractually chained, most corporately owned personality in modern hip-hop. So, get into this. Now, before we get into the receipts, let me catch y'all up. So, Rick Ross is on his estate, a 109-room house that used to belong to Evander Holyfield, sitting on over 300 acres of prime Georgia soil. It is humid, and Ross is not in a booth spitting bars. He is holding a stack of legal-size manila folders. He taps his screen, he goes live, and there is no music, no hype man, no camera crew. It is just Rick Ross, the folders, and the whole internet watching in real time. And, y'all, the second he opened that first folder, the whole game changed, because for 15 years, 50 Cent has walked around the internet like an untouchable king. Curtis Jackson has been the undisputed heavyweight of social media trolling. He mocked Ross for his taxes, for flying commercial, for his weight, for his baby mama drama. He turned Rick Ross into a cartoon character and dragged him around like a chew toy. But on this unedited stream, the chessboard did not just flip. It got picked up, snapped in half, and thrown in the pool. And, look, in my personal opinion, this is the moment 50 Cent has been quietly terrified of for a decade. Because Rick Ross did not throw a punch. He handed the internet a magnifying glass and said, "Look at the paperwork." Ross starts calm. Almost bored. He whispers into the mic. He tells 50 Cent that while the world thinks he bought his massive Shreveport studio, the bank actually owns the brick, and Curtis Jackson is just paying the interest. Let that sit. The man who mocked Rick Ross for a tax lien is being called out, on camera, as a leaseholder. A tenant. A guy paying rent on a trophy he has been posting on Instagram like it is a personal empire. Y'all, the irony is not heavy. It is nuclear. Because 50 Cent has spent years selling one specific story. The self-made mogul. The bulletproof businessman. The vitamin water genius who turned a shooting into a fortune and a fortune into a television empire. Curtis Jackson built a whole brand on being the smartest guy in every room. And now, out of nowhere, Rick Ross is holding up unredacted corporate filings, deposition transcripts, and bank discovery records from their tangled web of lawsuits, reading them out loud like a foreclosure notice. And the moment the world realized those documents were real, verified, and publicly filed, the internet did not laugh. The internet went silent. And then the internet went to work. Now, for those of you who may not know, Curtis Jackson's online power was never really about jokes. It was about invincibility. 50 Cent had convinced the culture that he could not be touched, could not be embarrassed, could not be broke. Every enemy he ever had, Ja Rule, Fat Joe, The Game, Diddy, Floyd Mayweather, and yes, Rick Ross, ended up looking smaller after 50 was done with them. So when Ross tapped that live button, most fans expected another round of loud clown moments. What they got instead was a corporate audit dressed up as a live stream. And that, y'all, is the exact moment the empire cracked. But here is where it gets crazy. Within seconds of Rick Ross ending the stream, that footage was ripped, sliced, and shipped across the global digital pipeline. TikTok grabbed it. X grabbed it. YouTube channels grabbed it. Instagram Reels grabbed it. High-resolution screenshots of those unredacted documents were suddenly being zoomed in on by amateur forensic accountants, financial YouTubers, and hip-hop journalists who normally would not have cared about a rap feud. And this is where 50 Cent's biggest weapon turned into his biggest problem. Because 50 Cent built his empire on speed. On being faster, louder, and meaner than the response. But viral velocity does not have a favorite. Once the internet decided to inspect the paperwork, Curtis Jackson could not outrun it, out-meme it, or out-troll it. Historically, the comment sections under any 50 Cent post functioned like a monument to his financial invincibility. He mocked an enemy, the internet laughed with him. Every time. But on this afternoon, the comment sections flipped. People were not asking Rick Ross for jokes. They were asking Rick Ross for more paperwork. And, y'all, that is a shift you cannot walk back. That is not gossip. That is a re-rating of the entire brand. The second the audience started reading balance sheets instead of memes, the joke stopped being funny. Now, in my personal opinion, do I think 50 Cent is broke? No, I don't. Okay. But that is not the point. The point is the difference between being rich and being sovereign. And that is the wound Rick Ross opened, on purpose. Because for months, Curtis Jackson has been riding a national wave of press over his production home in Shreveport, Louisiana. He was on morning shows. He was in Forbes. He was telling the world that he had personally moved a chunk of Hollywood down to Louisiana. That he had built a Southern Hollywood. That he was single-handedly transforming a forgotten municipal giant into a production capital. And, y'all, the internet believed him. But those documents acted like a solvent on cheap paint. Because when you actually read those municipal contracts, and Ross read them slowly, like he was in court, the grand acquisition of that studio was not a purchase of land and brick. It was a heavily subsidized leasehold agreement with the city of Shreveport. Curtis Jackson's production company signed a 30-year lease on a property the city itself only purchased for around $3.8 million in 2022. The headline rent looked like a joke, a tiny annual number that made 50 look like a negotiating genius. But the fine print told the real story. Under that lease, G-Unit is fully responsible for every dime of operational costs, capital expenditures, and maintenance on a massive, aging concrete facility. In one signature, Shreveport offloaded nearly $180,000 a year in upkeep onto Curtis Jackson's balance sheet. If the soundstages sit dark, or the tax incentives shift a percentage point, 50 Cent is still on the hook for the bleeding overhead of a municipal white elephant. And, y'all, in the sophisticated world of commercial real estate, that is a brilliant, low-risk move. But in the unforgiving court of hip-hop public opinion, it was framed as one thing. Renting the trophy. Curtis Jackson, the same man who spent years calling Rick Ross a fraud, was suddenly exposed as a tenant. But that was the appetizer, y'all. Because then Rick Ross turned to the crown jewel. The power television universe. The most important asset in 50 Cent's modern identity. For a decade, Curtis Jackson has waved that power deal in the face of every rapper who doubted him. His entire post-G-Unit era has been built on being a premium cable kingmaker. A television mogul. A Hollywood executive who happens to rap. And for a long time, that positioning worked. Power made hundreds of millions. It launched spin-offs. It launched careers. It launched an entire cultural conversation. But the corporate flowcharts Rick Ross held up exposed the harsh reality of television IP ownership. And the legal truth is brutal. Starz and Lionsgate own the keys to the vault. They own the characters. They own the brand. They own the master tapes. They own the copyrights. Curtis Jackson is a highly compensated executive producer. But he does not own the power universe. He never did. He was, in the cold terminology of corporate law, a very well-paid tenant farmer working land owned by a Wall Street conglomerate. And in September of 2022, when his Starz deal officially ended, Curtis Jackson himself admitted in now-deleted posts that he was desperately trying to buy his universe back so it could travel with him. But he could not. Because he never owned it. When his contract expired, the power universe stayed inside the Starz vault. And Rick Ross knew that. And Rick Ross said it, on camera, in his outdoor voice. Now, in my personal opinion, this is where 50 Cent's armor cracked. Because he could survive being called broke. He could survive being called fat. He could survive being called a rat. What he cannot survive is being called common. By holding up those filings, Rick Ross did something more surgical than any diss record ever could. He did not make 50 Cent look poor. He made 50 Cent look employed. But, y'all, we cannot fully appreciate this livestream unless we rewind to 2008, when this war began. Rick Ross and 50 Cent did not stumble into each other. They collided. The catalyst was almost embarrassingly small. A dismissive glance at the 2008 BET Hip Hop Awards. Curtis Jackson, sitting at the peak of his G-Unit empire, backed by Eminem and Dr. Dre, allegedly looked right through Rick Ross like he was not even there. For a rising star whose entire persona was built on absolute respect, that cold glance was a declaration of war. And 50 Cent, always the smarter operator, did not respond with bars. He responded with biography. He unearthed a truth that by every metric of hip-hop credibility should have ended Rick Ross's career on the spot. Official records showing that Rick Ross had previously worked as a correctional officer inside a Florida prison. In 2008, in a genre still attached to street kingpin mythology, that was the ultimate kill shot. And 50 Cent did not just leak the receipts. He weaponized it. He made cartoon parodies of Officer Ricky. He held up prison guard badges on national television. He filmed interviews with the mother of Ross's child. In almost any previous era of hip-hop, that would have been game over. But Rick Ross did something unprecedented. He refused to fold. He did not deny the paperwork. He did not run from the badge. He leaned harder into the myth. He branded himself as the biggest boss. He signed street-validated talent like Meek Mill and Whale. He built Maybach Music Group into an empire. And he proved that in the digital age, a brilliantly performed myth is more powerful than a documented biography. That single decision, refusing to be embarrassed, is why we are standing here today watching Rick Ross hold up corporate documents by a swimming pool. And, y'all, the parallel histories of these two men run deeper than their public battles. Take Rick Ross's Fayetteville mansion, the Promised Land. Originally built by Evander Holyfield as Villa Vittoriosa. A 109-room megastructure, a trophy of Holyfield's boxing career. But that 54,000-square-foot palace carries its own gravity. Between a mortgage that ballooned from $10 to $14 million, crushing child support, and IRS pressure, that estate became a luxury-lined prison for Holyfield. By 2012, J.P. Morgan Chase repossessed it in a very public foreclosure. When Rick Ross bought it out of the wreckage in 2014 for around $5.9 million, it was framed as the ultimate cultural triumph. The former correctional officer buying the palace of a heavyweight king. But, y'all, the ghost of Holyfield's downfall still hangs over those hills. As Curtis Jackson dryly pointed out for years, a property that costs more to maintain than an operating nightclub is not an asset. It is a beautifully manicured black hole waiting for cash flow to slip. Now, while Rick Ross was balancing the economics of his Georgia palace, 50 Cent was staring down his own reckoning. In 2015, Curtis Jackson filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Ross's camp treated it like a victory parade. But the truth was a calculated legal maneuver. 50 Cent was facing a $5 million jury verdict for leaking a sensitive video involving Lastonia Leviston, who was dating Rick Ross at the time, plus a staggering $17.2 million judgment tied to a failed headphone venture with Sleek Audio. Instead of paying both in full, Curtis Jackson used federal bankruptcy court as a shield. He restructured his debt. He froze his liabilities. And in the process, he had to testify under oath that his actual net worth was a fraction of his public projection. That is the moment the mask slipped for the first time. But, much like Rick Ross, 50 Cent survived. He rebuilt around power. He rebranded himself as a Hollywood producer. For years, both men have walked around performing absolute financial invincibility, while quietly navigating tax liens, foreclosures, and massive legal judgments. Now, this is where Rick Ross's livestream did the most damage. In the modern entertainment economy, there is a huge chasm between being a wealthy individual and being a sovereign corporate entity. One relies on fee-for-service. The other operates on direct equity ownership. And Rick Ross, in a slow, patronizing tone, held that chasm up to the camera and made Curtis Jackson stand on the wrong side of it. He contrasted the Shreveport lease with his own model. Because while 50 Cent's wealth is tangled up in illiquid network licensing agreements and leveraged municipal leases, Rick Ross's portfolio is aggressively direct-to-consumer and cash flow positive. He owns a network of over 25 Wingstop franchises. Those are not speculative investments. Those are high-margin brick-and-mortar operations that print money every day, whether Hollywood is on strike or not. His partnership with Luke Belair is not an endorsement deal. It is an active equity stake. His mansion sits on land he owns outright. His franchises pay him daily. And then Rick Ross opened the deepest wound in the catalog. The ownership of the masters. The cultural weight of get rich or die tryin' is undisputed. But the legal ownership of those masters lives permanently inside the vaults of Interscope and Universal Music Group. For every dollar that album generates on streaming, Curtis Jackson receives an artist royalty percentage, while the lion's share of the equity flow goes to corporate shareholders who have never held a microphone. That is not opinion. That is paperwork. And Rick Ross read it out loud. Now, let me know in the comments, do you actually think 50 Cent can recover from being audited on a live stream? Because we still have not gotten to the most vicious part. What Rick Ross did next was not financial. It was psychological. And in my personal opinion, this is where Rick Ross moved from rap rival to full-blown chess grandmaster. For 15 years, Curtis Jackson has reigned as an apex predator of digital humiliation. Identify your opponent's deepest insecurity, drag it into the public square, mock it until it becomes their defining trait. 50 Cent does not try to win arguments. He tries to destroy his rival's sanity. And for a long time, Rick Ross survived by acting like a human shield of pure luxury. Every time 50 Cent threw a grenade, Ross bought another Rolls-Royce, posted another pool party, bragged about another Wingstop. It was a defense mechanism. An attempt to outflex the humiliation. But Curtis Jackson's twisted genius was flipping every flex into evidence of financial strain. When Rick Ross posted videos of himself mowing his own grass, 50 did not see a self-made man enjoying his land. He saw a leveraged debtor saving on landscaping bills. A multimillionaire cutting his own lawn is an eccentric hobbyist. A cash-strapped mogul doing the same thing is a squatter. That reframing device was 50 Cent's most powerful weapon for over a decade. But on this afternoon, Rick Ross executed a psychological counterstrike of breathtaking precision. He understood that the only way to disarm an apex bully is to strip him of his mask of superiority. Rick Ross did not try to out-troll 50 Cent with memes. He did something worse. He patronized him. By holding up those records, Ross reframed the entire G-Unit narrative in one sentence. He did not make 50 look poor. He made 50 look common. Like a highly paid corporate employee who has to report to a board, lease property from a city, and ask Hollywood executives for permission to touch his own IP. And then Rick Ross delivered the kill shot. Still poolside. Casual. He sarcastically extended 50 Cent a business partnership. He offered, on camera, to sit down and look over 50's Shreveport renderings. He offered him a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to secure funding from a true liquid boss. That offer was concentrated psychological venom. Because it did not sound like an attack. It sounded like sympathy. Rick Ross reframed himself as a calm, wealthy benefactor gently offering charity to a struggling independent producer. In one clip, he turned Curtis Jackson's entire master businessman identity on its head. You can fight anger. You can fight insult. You cannot fight pity. Pity is terminal. Pity is what people feel for somebody they no longer fear. And Rick Ross closed with a line so vicious it belongs in a corporate warfare textbook. He said, with performative sadness, that when his legal team pulled up 50 Cent's actual bank accounts during discovery, he did not feel angry. He actually felt bad for him. Y'all, that is not a diss. That is an obituary read out loud while the target is still standing. Now, in my personal opinion, this is the moment the balance of power in hip-hop trolling permanently shifted. Because the psychological leverage that made Curtis Jackson so terrifying for 15 years was the belief that he was untouchable. That belief has now been stress-tested against actual paperwork. And it did not hold. But, y'all, let me tell you something even wilder. As the dust settles, we are left with a deeper truth. This is no longer a petty feud about airline tickets or unpaid taxes. This is a permanent, self-sustaining ecosystem. A perpetual motion machine of modern digital relevance. The unspoken irony is that despite their animosity, Rick Ross and 50 Cent are locked in a symbiotic embrace. They are two halves of the same cultural currency. Curtis Jackson's trolling keeps Rick Ross's boss persona sharp, forcing him to constantly defend his crown with bigger displays of luxury. Meanwhile, Rick Ross's unshakable resilience gives 50 Cent his most compelling target. Neither of them actually wants this war to end. The war itself is their most valuable intellectual property. Conflict is not a distraction from the business. Conflict is the business. Every live stream. Every leaked tax document. Every poolside video. Every corporate document held up to a camera. All of it generates millions of impressions, thousands of articles, and massive spikes in streaming numbers. Curtis Jackson and Rick Ross have commodified their mutual hatred into a multi-million-dollar franchise. And if you zoom out, this feud is a mirror. A mirror on the changing nature of the American dream, and the hip-hop dream of financial independence. Two philosophies of wealth, both flawed. On one side, the Curtis Jackson paradigm, a master of corporate leverage, a man who survived bankruptcy by using federal court as a shield, and who built a television empire by licensing his brand to giants like Starz and municipalities like Shreveport. Sophisticated, debt-leveraged, institutional. But deeply dependent on corporate gatekeepers, municipal landlords, and network licensing structures. The wealth of a powerful executive. But an executive nonetheless. On the other side, the William Leonard Roberts model. Cash flow heavy, direct-to-consumer, sovereign. Rick Ross does not rely on television networks or municipal subsidies. He relies on physical Wingstop franchises, direct equity stakes in liquor brands, and 300 acres of prime Georgia soil. Raw, liquid independence. But even Rick Ross's model is constantly threatened by the overhead of a 109-room white elephant and the specter of tax collectors. Neither man is the pure version of what he performs. Curtis Jackson is not the untouchable billion-dollar genius who owns everything he touches. He is a highly skilled contractor operating inside corporate contracts. Rick Ross is not the untouchable cartel boss who answers to nobody. He is an entrepreneur walking a high wire between cash flow and the cost of his own mythology. And this Rick Ross livestream, more than any diss record, forced the culture to see both of them clearly for the first time in a very long time. And in my personal opinion, that clarity is what makes this stream historic. Rick Ross did not need punchlines. He did not need a beat. He walked outside, sat by his pool, opened a folder, and reminded the whole hip-hop world that behind the diamond chains, behind the television credits, behind the private jets, both of these men are still fully subject to the cold, unyielding laws of the ledger. And the ledger, y'all, does not lie. So, I want to know what you guys think. Do you think Rick Ross actually won this round for good, or is Curtis Jackson already loading up his next unhinged Instagram caption behind the scenes? Do you think 50 Cent can survive being audited in public? Is the Shreveport studio deal genius leverage or leveraged embarrassment? Is Rick Ross the real big boss, or is he just louder than the paperwork behind him? And be honest, y'all, whose model of wealth do you actually respect more? The corporate strategist who leverages other people's money, or the franchise owner who owns the land under his feet? Y'all let me know what you think in the comments below, and let the debate begin. But that's all I have for you, and I'll talk to y'all later.